Hello there, I am the banker. Are you checking into your checkings account today? Or perhaps something more? Would you like to make a bond investment? What's that? Your name is Rob Ing? Oh, you're robbing the bank. Oh my good heavens. Welcome back to the Mid-Mass channel. Before we get into anything, I would like to remind you that many of you are not subscribed. So, if you're new here and you like the content, feel free to subscribe, because after all, it is indeed free. I'm not stealing anything from you behind the scenes. Speaking of money and being free, this video is all about whether or not you need to actually spend money on Dungeons & Dragons and how expensive Dungeons & Dragons is. When many people start looking into D&D, they see all these people with these figurines and thousands of dice and all these crazy little things, which can add up quite quickly to the thousands, if not even tens of thousands of dollars. So the question is, how expensive is Dungeons & Dragons? And where do you start? If you want to spend money, that is, of course. If you're familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, you will probably know the immediate and short answer to all of this, which is D&D costs, get this, get ready, drum roll, come on. Yeah. D&D costs $0. Unless you count, like, a computer as a cost. You don't even need a computer, you just go to, like, the library to look things up on Google. Because at the end of the day, the majority of the resources you need for Dungeons & Dragons can be found online for no cost. And I'm not talking about, like, piracy here, mighty. I'm not talking about piracy. I'm talking just, there are articles that are free. They give you the rules, the basic rules, and the character sheets you could just print out for free, probably at the library. And if it's not free, it's going to be like $0.25 at the very most. And dice, Google has its own built-in dice system. Yes, actually it does. If you look on Google Chrome, you type in D20, a D20 will appear and you will be able to roll it. It's very similar to the fact that if you type flip a coin into Google, there will be actually a coin flipping system built in. So if you don't actually have any dice, Google has you covered just for free. You get a D20, a D8, a D6, a D12, all of them. So really, you just don't have to spend any money on D&D because the majority of the content comes from the mind. Although, I'm sure you have a question, if not several. Then why do people own all these figurines, all this dice, all these books? What's the purpose of everything that's free?
Dungeons & Dragons is a hobby, and a very expensive one.
I shouldn't say it's expensive outright. It's just one of those hobbies where, say you love playing Counter-Strike Global Offensive and you want to buy a bunch of skins for your weapons. That's kind of a hobby. You enjoy that game, so you just put a lot of money into it, even though you really don't need to if you want to play the game effectively. Dungeons & Dragons is the exact same way, where you don't actually have to spend money on just about anything. Maybe you might want some dice or maybe one of the rule books, but you really just don't have to spend money on anything. But if you do, it's just for your own personal preferences. And obviously that cost can rack up kind of quickly depending upon what you're buying. Say you're like me, who likes dice. You might want to buy several pairs of dice, because maybe just that 1d6 that you own is not enough when you're, rolling 8d6. Then you have to roll the same d6. 1d6, 2d6. 3d6, instead of just doing it all at once with all your crazy amounts of dice. Or perhaps you want to buy a figurine to represent your character that you've made, or your NPC, depending upon if you're the player or the dungeon master. And, painting all these figurines and stuff, that's where the cost kind of begins to add up. It's all these little figurines, all this little dice, and the rule books that you can buy as well. So overall, Dungeons & Dragons baseline costs 0 doubloons. 0. No pirate gold required. But if you're looking to spend a little money on Dungeons & Dragons, but you only want to buy the things that are just going to immediately make your life just a little easier, here's a couple of the mid-mask recommendations. At first, I definitely recommend buying at least one bag of Dungeons and Dragons dice. So that bag would include the D20, the D12, the D10, the D8, the D6, and the D4. This is usually quite inexpensive, usually less than $10, if not less than $5. But you can always buy the more fancy dice if you're looking to just spice things up because you like to collect shiny things. But dice are probably one of the more essential things you're going to want, especially if you're playing in person. When you're playing online, dice matter considerably less, but some people still like to have them on hand. It does make being a dungeon master a lot easier when you just want to roll a d20 real quick to see if something happens or something doesn't happen, or something succeeds, something doesn't succeed, and so on and so forth. After that, if you are a dungeon master, I recommend buying the Dungeon Master's Guide. The Dungeon Master's Guide, as you could surmise by the name, is the Dungeon Master's Guide. It has many of the rules you'll need to be a dungeon master, a lot of the tips on how to make a world, how to make a combat flow alright, and how to balance things that you are making yourself. It's one of the essential things you're going to want if you're just going to go into this for the long term and you're not just doing this as a one-time thing. If you're looking to be a long-term campaign or a long-term player, a Dungeon Master's Guide is just good for understanding the basic rules of D&D. Which also leads me to the other rulebook. Yes, the Player's Handbook. The Player's Handbook, as you can imagine, very simple. It has a lot of the rules you'll need to make a character for your Dungeons & Dragons game. It covers everything from races, classes, spells, equipment, weapons, and some combat, and some other things that are really important if you're making a character. Even if you're making an NPC as a Dungeon Master, you're probably still going to want the Player's Handbook, because you're going to want to know, hey, what are my players doing? What are their classes like? What are their races like? What are all these features that they have? These two books are probably the most important ones. There are other ones out there, which I will get to in a minute, but I can't stress enough that these are the quintessential books that you're going to want. And they also come in physical and digital forms, which I'm sure you can find. So whatever your preference is, go ahead, champ, go get them. But other than a couple sheets of paper, those two rule books, and your nice bag of dice, you don't actually need a whole lot more than that. A lot of D&D is, like I said, up here in the mind. So if your players are okay with it, if you're the dungeon master, a lot of it could just be rolling the dice, the character sheets, and then talking about your epic adventure. You might feel compelled with shows like Critical Role that they have these intricate combat maps and all these little figurines and props and stuff. You don't have to do that. A lot of DMs, including myself at some point, felt pressured to have these super high quality things going on for your Dungeons & Dragons game. But if you're just starting out, whether you're a player or dungeon master, you don't need a crazy figurine, you don't need a crazy combat board. You could just have a lot of fun. I mean, like a lot of fun with just talking, believe it or not. Obviously, it might be more preferable to have a combat map, because trying to do some combat in your mind purely can be a little harder when you're measuring distances. But if you, as a dungeon master, are pretty good at keeping track of, this guy's 30 feet away, scribble that out, now he's 25 feet away, and so on, you can go through combat perfectly fine without a hitch. Now, if you want some more personal recommendations of what you should buy and spend your money on, because spending money is a tough choice in this economy. It's, I recommend buying the Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and the Monster Manual. Xanathar's Guide to Everything is just, think of it as the big DLC to D&D. Completely optional, but it does have a lot of extra things in it, like for character creation, dungeon master rules, creatures, spells, subclasses, so on and so forth. It is one of the better rule books out there, and I highly recommend that you get it. Obviously, though, you don't need to, and if you want to see what's going on about Xanathar's Guide to Everything before you buy it, there are also just a lot of online resources to kind of look into what it's talking about. And I mentioned the Monster Manual, and I really only recommend this if you're a dungeon master, or perhaps you're just a very inquisitive player, because, as the name would tell you, the Monster Manual is just monsters. It has all the quintessential creatures that you would expect to find in D&D. So your zombies, your skeletons, your liches, and beholders. Other crazy guys like this one. And if you play D&D online, I can recommend a couple of virtual tabletops. There's things like Roll20, which is completely free, although there is some subscription-based stuff in there, so if you're not too keen on that, that's alright, it's still free, and you can do quite a lot with that freedom. There's also Tailspire, which does cost money, but it is a very 3D and very immersive sort of tabletop experience you can do online. But the one I would wholeheartedly recommend, and this one does come with, unfortunately, the highest price tag, but trust me, it's worth it, is Foundry Virtual Tabletop. If you love being very technical, very exact with your rules and your maps and so on, Foundry has just about everything you'd ever need. Mainly because there is a large community surrounding it that has lots and lots and lots and lots of add-ons. So if Foundry doesn't have exactly what you're looking for right away, there's likely an add-on for it, which is fantastic. Now, I've been using Foundry for about a year, 2 years now, and I gotta say, I love it. It's got everything you'd want. Virtual maps, virtual character sheets, virtual this, virtual that.
Virtual reality?
Notably, it does not have virtual reality, but you get the point. It is very customizable, highly technical. I would say the only real con to it, besides its higher price tag, is the fact that it does have a bit of a learning curve. Especially if you're new to the rules of D&D, it can be a little complicated. So if you're brand new to D&D, I recommend trying Roll20 first, and once you get more familiar with the rules and how things work, then I'd move on to Foundry. But again, I should say throughout all of this, it's all optional. You don't need Foundry. Roll20 is free, so if you want to use it, go ahead. Dice are completely optional since Google just has them built in. At the end of the day, all you need is a pen and paper. Just baseline. Or you don't even need a pen and paper. If you just have a good memory, you don't need anything. You could just sit there and be like, you are entering the dungeon. Yes, you are an elven paladin. You are level 13 with 83 hit points. How do I know this? Because my forehead is massive. Now, I hope this was helpful to you. I hope this was somewhat insightful. I hope you gained something out of this whole venture of a video. I bid you adieu, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Adios.